The Russian army has made significant progress in the struggle for freedom, especially in this critical time period. Kiev's grand offensive plans reach the deepest defense lines of Russia. For this purpose, the armed forces of Ukraine increased the effective offensive operations of the southern front lines against the Black Sea coast. The peninsula, which Russian leader Vladimir Putin attaches the most importance to, has become a shooting range that Ukrainians have repeatedly targeted. As the defense of Crimea and the Russian air defenses in southern Ukraine continued to collapse, the Russians awaited an attack at Kherson or Zaporizhia in Crimea. But the Ukrainians put the Russians in the wrong corner and targeted Berdyansk. Ukrainian armed forces launched a stunning series of attacks this week on Berdyansk port, the critical logistics hub in southern Ukraine, and Russian military bases and arsenals there. The Russians were helpless against this week's long-range counterattack by Ukraine, focused on the Berdyansk port. The Russian-controlled port of Berdyansk, Russian military bases, and arsenals there were blown up as dozens of Russian ships fled off the Ukrainian south coast. The Russians suffered heavy ammunition and soldier losses. The most striking of the Russian losses was the destruction of one more Russian S-300 air defense system. Thus, the Russian army faced a very difficult situation, losing at least 13 Siemens 300 air defenses since the beginning of the war. Ukraine's regional military administration reported that the area within the Russian air defense system was detected by Ukrainian forces, and a Russian S-300 long-range surface-to-air missile system was blown up after the explosion. Thus, the Ukrainians broke new ground. It was claimed that the Ukrainian forces also used Storm Shadow long-range missiles in this offensive operation. Tension levels in Ukraine's southern front lines reached their peak as Storm Shadow missiles destroyed the Russian S-300 air defense system. It has also been confirmed that the Ukrainians destroyed the award-winning S-400 air defense system worth approximately $2 billion with HIMARS in the past weeks. This is the Russian army's second verified loss of the S-400 air defense system. Let's talk about the very critical Ukrainian offensive that wiped out the Russian S-300 air defense systems in Berdyansk and their importance for Ukraine's liberation of Crimea. The loss of a total of 13 Siemens 300 air defense systems in this critical time period completely changed the situation on Ukraine's southern fronts. These air defense system losses of the Russians occurred mainly in the Kherson region. In addition, the Russian troops who lost their S-300 in Crimea became more and more desperate for air defense over time in the Kherson region, especially after the new year. To date, 5 S-300 air defense systems have been lost. Together with Berdyansk, the Russian army lost 6 S-300 air defense systems only in 2023. Ukraine's southern operation, which started with attacks on the ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol, has intensified in the past weeks. Last month, on the left bank of the Dnipro River, Ukrainian forces also destroyed the missile launcher of a Russian Army S-300 anti-aircraft system. This attack of Ukraine dealt a very hard blow to the Russians in this period of time when rumors about the S-300 defense system not fully functioning were heard. The Ukrainians neutralizing this missile system in the Dnipro, Kherson, and Berdyansk created an earthquake effect in Moscow. In the past weeks, the Russians have begun to send their S-300 defense systems back to their manufacturers due to constant malfunctions. After the Ukrainian attacks, this critical problem of the Russian army in the field of air defense resurfaced. On the other hand, Russian S-300s are also in Crimea. In fact, it was claimed that the most important reason for the unmanned aerial vehicle attacks carried out by the Ukrainian forces over the past week was the inability of the S-300 systems to be sufficiently functional. In fact, the Russians had mostly moved Ukraine's southern front lines to the Crimean Peninsula. But the refocusing of the Ukrainians on the Crimean Peninsula and the southern coast proved the inadequacy of the air defense systems there. This upset the plans of the invading troops to recapture the Kherson region because the Russians could not respond to the airstrikes of the Ukrainian forces in this region and also could not carry out any offensive action. The loss of a total of 6 S-300s in a short period of time by the Russians was starting to annoy Moscow. In a period of about 8 months, the loss of 13 Siemens 300 defense systems by the Russians caused the Ukrainian forces to focus much more on the southern front lines. The loss of 13 Siemens 300 air defense systems in such a short period of time by the Russian army was enough to bring the tension in the south of Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula to a peak. So how did Russia get into a stalemate on Ukraine's southern front lines after losing important air defense systems such as the S-300 and S-400? Satellite images revealed a multi-layered network of Russian anti-tank trenches, mazes of trenches, concrete dragon teeth, barricades, steel, hedgehog barriers, reels of barbed wire, and minefields. The Russian army uses air defense systems such as the S-300 on the coastlines of Kherson, Melitopol, and Zaporizhzhia in the southern region of Ukraine. By examining hundreds of satellite images, we have identified some key points in key trenches and other fortifications built in southern Ukraine since October. While Russia mostly uses the S-300 air defense system in the south of Ukraine around the Crimea, it also uses systems such as the S-400 from time to time. It was understood that such security measures were mostly in the vicinity of Crimea. The Russians were very afraid that the armed forces of Ukraine will retake the Crimean Peninsula. So why are Russians so concerned about the Ukrainian liberation of Crimea, especially now? When we look at all these situations, we witness that the Ukrainian armed forces have been this close to the Crimean Peninsula for the first time since the beginning of the war. What happened in Kherson? Russia's loss of S-300 and S-400 air defense systems, relatives of Russian troops in Berdyansk, Mariupol, and Ukraine's coastlines, and their own evacuation. All this paves the way for the Ukrainian forces to take back Crimea. Russia's most heavily fortified frontline area is the southern province of Zaporizhzhia, where Ukraine is expected to attempt to break and cut the land bridge connecting Russian territory to occupied Crimea. There, the Russian forces continue to build mostly anti-tank trenches, zigzag trenches. The defenses stretch from Armyansk in the north to Tsankawi in the northwest. Both are important transportation hubs and gateways to the peninsula. Apart from Crimea and the eastern front lines, Russia paid special attention to the Berdyansk airport near the Sea of Azov. The airport is a known hub for Russian military aircraft. In addition, the towns of Tokmak, Poloi, Bilmak, and Okarativat, which are located at important road junctions, were completely surrounded by walls. After capturing the eastern cities of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and Popasna in May and June 2022, Russia built layers of dragon teeth, trenches, and other barriers across a large occupied area. Russia has also set up a strong defensive line along the border of the eastern Luhansk province in the north, where Ukrainian forces are believed to be looking to break through from somewhere around the town of Kupiansk. Ukrainian forces keep a significant portion of Kherson under control after Russia announced that it had sealed one of the biggest setbacks ahead of President Vladimir Putin's invasion by completing the withdrawal of its forces from the city in the south. The advance of Kiev and Moscow's chaotic retreat along the Dnipro River under Ukrainian artillery fire meant that Russia surrendered the only provincial capital captured in the war and abandoned strategic positions. The advance liberated an area of 3,000 kilometers squared in just 6 days. It was Ukraine's biggest victory since it pushed back Russian troops from the capital in March. But as we mentioned in the video, Ukrainians can now look at the southern front lines and Crimea from a much broader perspective and take more effective steps in these areas. The war in Eastern Europe has gone through many phases to date, but the most striking stage in the Ukrainian war took place today. After weeks of preparation, the Ukrainian counteroffensive began after the shaping operations. Analysts believe Ukraine is currently in the early stages of its counterattack. Several Russian sources notice a dramatic increase in fire and attacks against their positions in the Zaporizhzhia direction during the night. Russian sources state that tanks attacked their positions and the bombardment continued non-stop. Tonight, all Russian military correspondents announced that Ukraine has launched the same counteroffensive in the direction of Zaporizhzhia. Today, Russian sources reported that there was a major offensive of the armed forces of Ukraine in the direction of Zaporozhye in the Orakov and Malaya Tokmak region. Ukrainian forces broke through the Russian lines and began to penetrate into the Russian front lines. Reports speak of an offensive by the Ukrainian army which sent the main forces into battle. It is claimed that the attack was supported by large artillery fire and HIMARS. After intense artillery preparation using various weapons, including self-propelled guns and Western-style towed howitzers, Ukrainian troops began to attack at dusk. East of the city of Orakov in the Zaporozhye region, Russian military correspondents reported that the return fire was very intense, including airstrikes about 2.5 hours after the start of the war. the intensity of Russian attacks began to decrease significantly. Half an hour later, the second wave of the Ukrainian counteroffensive began. The final major attack was reportedly carried out in the direction of Malaya-Toshimagaoka. Around 4 a.m., in fact, activity in the Zaporizhia Oblast had intensified in recent days. At least 6 explosions were heard near Russian-occupied Melitopol in the Zaporizhia Oblast the other day. At least 1 explosion was also reported on a railway in the Dolinsk district near Melitopol. Russian forces used this railway to transport military equipment and personnel. The biggest purpose of the Ukrainian armed forces attacking the railways is to disrupt Russia's supply lines. Russia's mostly heavily fortified frontline area is the southern province of Zaporizhia, where Ukraine is expected to attempt to break and cut the land bridge connecting Russian territory to occupied Crimea. There, Russian forces created a multi-layered defense consisting of anti-tank trenches, zigzag trenches, concrete dragon teeth, barricades, steel, hedgehog barriers, razor wire, and minefields. Russian forces are moving concrete pyramidal anti-tank structures known as Dragon's Teeth through Mariupol towards the town of Razivka in the Zaporizhia region. Video and photos showing the anti-tank structures being loaded and transported on trucks were shared on Telegram by the mayor of Ukraine, Petro Andriyashchenko. We will see in the coming days whether these anti-tank structures, which are a concrete reflection of the fear of the Russians, will work. However, the Ukrainian armed forces frequently share training videos that show that they have the potential to crush these fortifications with the Western tanks in their inventory. Also, Russia paid special attention to the Berdyansk airport near the Sea of Azov. The airport is known as a hub for Russian military aircraft. Last week, Russian officials claimed that Ukrainian forces had launched a massive offensive in Berdyansk. On the other hand, Russia, unable to prevent the Ukrainian attacks on the front lines, is watching desperately the attack in its own cities. Belgorod is one of the regions where cross-border attacks are most intense. The Russian city of Shebekino, a stone's throw from the Ukrainian border, has been under heavy Ukrainian bombardment in recent days. Shebekino residents flee and are evacuated. The Russian Volunteer Corps group attacked the town of Shebekino and the administrative building in the Belgorod region. The attack took place around 3 o'clock, WM Moscow time, after the massive bombing of civilian facilities in the Belgorod region. The Russian Volunteer Corps group attacked Russian territory near the Novaya Olshanka and Shebekino International Road checkpoint with 2 motorized infantry divisions reinforced with tanks. In a statement made by the Russian Ministry of Defense, it was stated that the attack was repelled by Russian soldiers. Also, limited raids and border bombardments in Belgorod Oblast are becoming the focus of criticism of the Russian military leadership. Wagner Group commander Yevgeny Prigozhin continued to use the situation in Belgorod Oblast to criticize the Ministry of Defense. On June 3rd and 4th, Prigozhin especially drew attention to the lack of response from the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. Colonel General Alexander Lapin and the chief of the Russian General Staff Commander Prigozhin offered to negotiate the release of prisoners of war held by the SSC and LSR if the Russian authorities failed to do so. The Wagner leader sarcastically responded to criticism of his proposal, saying that Russia has a problem with brave people. In another development, a critical dam on the Dnipro River in southern Ukraine collapsed overnight, putting thousands of people living downstream in danger. Residents of the riverside fishing villages and low-lying neighborhoods of Kherson were evacuated by bus and train as a result of the evacuations. Approximately 4,000 people remained in the region, which had a population of 13,000 before the flood. It was not immediately clear who committed the breach. Ukraine blamed Russia, saying there was an explosion in an engine room. Russia said that Ukrainian forces carried out a sabotage attack. The disaster came a day after American and Russian officials said a planned Ukrainian counteroffensive had begun in the Donetsk region east of Dnipro. The flood can divert the attention and resources of both sides from this counterattack. The dam and its surrounding infrastructure feature, located in the South Kherson area close to the war front, were damaged by shelling throughout the war. Last year, Russian forces took control of the dam and a nearby hydroelectric power station. It seems that the destruction of war is getting more and more striking with each passing day. What happened, both on the front lines and behind the front lines, wears out Russia in particular. Clashes between Ukraine and Russia raged on all fronts while the Russian forces were losing ground in Bakhmut. The sudden counterattacks launched by Ukraine in the south and on the Black Sea coast heavily routed the Russian army and navy, especially the Russian-controlled Mariupol and Berdyansk port. And the constant Ukrainian attack on the Crimean port of Sevastopol dealt heavy blows to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The most important component of Russia's missile attacks was undoubtedly the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The biggest threat to civilian life in Ukrainian cities was the Russian warships in the Black Sea. Almost all of the ships in the fleet are missile carriers, and the majority of the missile attacks against Ukraine came through the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The Ukrainian army had to put a stop to this, except for the Russian flagship Moskva, which was sunk at the beginning of the war. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, which could not suffer serious losses, has started to lose its effectiveness in the Black Sea with the regular and strategic attacks of Ukraine. Here in this video, we will talk about the losses and current effectiveness of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Come on, prepare your drinks, sit on your comfortable seats, and let's start to review the details of our news together during the Ukrainian war. The Ukrainian Defense Forces destroyed a total of 18 ships and boats of the Russian Navy. Vice Admiral Alexei Papa, commander of the naval forces of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, reported that, according to all reports, they saw 18 ships and boats destroyed by the Ukrainian Defense Forces. The admiral of the Ukrainian Navy stated that these are not only ships and boats destroyed by the Navy, but also ships destroyed by the ground forces and other units. As for amphibious logistics, a large amphibious ship and 2 supply ships were sunk by the Ukrainian artillery in conjunction with the attack on the port of Berdyansk. The other day, according to Papa, the Ukrainian Navy also destroyed a Serna-class landing craft and several Raptor-class boats recently that the Russian army used in operations to capture Snake Island. Papa noted that the rest of the ships are currently in ports controlled by the Russian Federation. So how accurate are the numbers? Papa announced, according to Western analysts, 17 ships and boats belonging to the Russian fleet were destroyed during the war. This matches the numbers given by Admiral Papa. In order to gain the superiority of the war, it was necessary to inflict great damage on the Black Sea Russian fleet. The Ukrainian army also drew a very successful graph in this direction. The Ukrainian Defense Forces used various methods and weapons to destroy Russian ships. For example, the Moscow missile cruiser, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, was destroyed by 2 Neptune missiles. In addition, Turkish-made Bayraktar DB-2 unmanned aerial vehicles and unmanned vehicles supplied by the UK became the main reasons for the increase in the losses of the Russian Navy. Especially Bayraktar DB-2 played a leading role in the destruction of Russian boats on the Dnipro River. All these losses caused the Russian Black Sea Fleet to be out of the war, albeit for a short time. But then the Russian Black Sea Fleet recovered faster than expected. The Russian army has doubled the number of missile carriers deployed in the Black Sea. Ukraine's Southern Operational Command reported 8 missile carriers equipped with Caliber missiles, and 2 submarines are currently in the Black Sea and on active combat duty. In addition, the Ukrainian Southern Command warned the people of the region that warnings of airstrikes should be taken seriously, given the available intelligence about the strengthening of reconnaissance activities by Russian drones and the readiness of Russian bombers to take off. As of last week, Russia was holding 4 Caliber-equipped missile carriers off the coast of Crimea. The doubling of this number is an indication that the Russian Navy is regrouping in the Black Sea. In addition to submarines in the Black Sea are doing their assigned naval duties in fear. Russian submarines, especially seen in the port of Odessa, are constantly coming to the area, probably for reconnaissance missions, come to the surface and then do not appear for a long time. Ukrainian military officials believe that the Russian submarines were probably on a reconnaissance mission and fled to the Black Sea immediately after the mission to avoid being hit by Ukrainian UAVs. So what is the current state of the Russian submarine fleet? Russia has recently begun to expand its submarine fleet. Russia's shipbuilding company, Admiralty Shipyards, a subsidiary of United Shipbuilding Corporation, has launched the 5th project, 363.3 submarine Mozaisk for the Russian Navy. Submarines of the modified 636 project have a higher combat effectiveness compared to previous projects. The ships have the optimum combination of acoustic stealth and target acquisition range, the latest inertial navigation system, a modern automated information and control system, and a powerful high-speed torpedo missile armament. Mozaisk is the 5th of the 363.3 class submarines in the Russian Navy, the fourth submarine of its class. UFO entered service in November of last year. Russia shows its submarine presence in almost every sea it can reach. There are constant reports of Russian submarine activities in the Black Sea, Baltic, North Sea, Pacific, and Atlantic. This poses a general Russian threat to the United States and its partners. So what kind of threats does this pose in the future? The head of the U.S. Northern Command recently told senators that Russia's most powerful Yasen-class attack submarines could be on permanent patrol on any of the U.S. coasts within 2 years. Broad census in the West has proven that the war in Ukraine has emptied, under-equipped, and mismanaged the once feared Russian armed forces. Accompanying the mediocre performance of the Russian Air Force, the Russian Army broke records with the loss of its soldiers and main battle tanks. The sinking of the Russian flagship Minsk in the Black Sea and the Russian Navy's poor performance in the Black Sea seem to point to a much reduced threat across the full spectrum of non-nuclear capabilities. The Russian surface fleet is predominantly obsolete, with a few modern fighters the size of frigates. In addition, submarine forces pose a potentially much more serious challenge because the actual analysis doesn't just involve counting platform numbers. It involves a much more complex assessment of readiness, material condition, weapon captivity, crew training, and proficiency. The exact extent of this threat is difficult to measure. Some might argue that it's in the interest of Western navies and industrial suppliers to exaggerate the threat by senior uniformed personnel. What can be said with certainty is that Russian submarine activity increased significantly in the decade preceding the Ukrainian war. So why are submarines so important to Russian approval? The number of ships that the Russian Navy can use is not even close to the number of ships used by the Soviets in their golden age. Therefore, Russians, lacking numerical advantage, now have no choice but to strive for qualitative equality. This has been tried with some success through weapon and sensor development, with a great effort to match the noise reduction capabilities of Western designs. At the end of the Cold War, the advent of Silent Victor III-class SSNs finally began to challenge NATO's assumption that they could outcompete noisy Soviet ships. With the aid of the underwater fixed sonar arrays of the Sound Surveillance Network, it was often possible to determine the approximate Russian submarine arrangements, even if other marine assets had to be localized and shadowed. Thanks to a US-based spy gang, Russian designers got an idea of the acoustic hygiene measures that had been painstakingly and extensively developed over the decades by the USN and were able to quickly implement them into their designs. The new Yasen-class submarines based on the Akula class build on this knowledge. Although it was developed and delivered painstakingly and slowly, it can now exert tactical and even strategic effect. In addition, the Kilo and Lada-class conventional submarines owned by the Russian fleet should not be underestimated. These submarines are shorter-range submarines operating in the Barents Sea and the Baltic and are well-suited for coastal missions. First Sebastopol-based submarines have launched cruise missile attacks on Ukraine and will be by far the biggest threat to any NATO warship that may sail into the Black Sea.